Welcome. I'm David Levi Strauss. I'm the new chair of the Art Criticism and Writing graduate program here at SVA. Carter Ratcliff is part of an honored and honorable tradition of poets writing about art. It's a tradition that I hold dear. At a certain point in the history of art and criticism, it became fashionable to call what Ratcliff and other poet critics do belletristic criticism. This is usually said in a superior tone, sometimes with a sneer. It's a put down. This attitude still astonishes me. That you can't hear at all? I'm sorry? Okay. Oh, there you go. This attitude still astonishes me, that writing beautifully should be disparaged as not being objective enough, I guess. This has always seemed to me to be the height of Protestant masochism. But we're free of those constricting bonds tonight, so feel free to enjoy yourselves. Carter Ratcliff's poems were first published in 1968 in The World from St. Mark's Poetry Project, and soon afterward, his first gallery reviews began appearing in Art News. Since then, his writing on art has appeared in all the major art magazines around the world and in numerous catalogs and books. He's written books on John Singer Sargent, Robert Longo, Jackson Pollock, and Andy Warhol. His books of poetry include Fever Coast, Give Me Tomorrow, and Arrivederci Modernismo from 2006. He's been an editor at Art News, Art International, and Saturday Review, and he continues as contributing editor to Art in America, Sculpture Magazine, and Art on Paper. Carter Ratcliff believes that, quote, art, visual, literary, whatever, is not a specialized activity, but a part of our shared social lives and part of the larger culture, not just art culture. And yet, he says, I don't believe that art is just a vehicle for socially and culturally useful messages. So I will be trying in my talk to say what I do believe about the relations between art, society, and culture. Please welcome Carter Ratcliff.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. You mentioned the sorts of people in the art world who disapprove of poet critics. I have a paragraph anyway of disapproval toward them, so it'll balance out. And thank you all for coming. Am I audible? Okay. The title, The Point of Art, I mean, that's deliberately vague or too general. I'm not sure that one can really pin down the point of art. Oh, it's such a huge topic. I'm going to put my wristwatch out here so I keep track of myself and don't do too many digressions. It is a huge topic, and I'm not proposing to say anything definitive or settle the matter. I basically want to throw some ideas and some images out and point in certain directions. Behind all these remarks is a thought that there's a constant conflict between the closed and the open, between closed systems and open systems, between those who want to control everything, have a closed system, and thus defeat or dream of defeating or imagine that they're defeating the contingencies of life, of everything, as opposed to those who may not like every contingency that pops up, but somehow can accept that they always will be popping up and have figured out some way to live with them. It's the difference between the rigid and the limber, or the authoritarian and, I don't know, the non-authoritarian. So that's behind everything I'm saying, and I suppose it's no surprise to know that I'm on the side of freedom, limberness, and open systems. Because the relationship between art and society and art and culture is so wide open that it's impossible to say anything definitive about it. But again, sort of point in certain directions. Before I go any farther, let me just run through the images I have. I'm not quite sure why I want to do this. I think it might just be interesting to have them, or to have seen them. I won't say anything about them now. That one. Actually, I think there are only 9 or 10. Pardon me? Oh, sure. I'll run through the whole batch again. That's the last one. Okay. Gee, what happened? I think somehow it got a little smaller. Great, thank you. So I don't want to say anything about them now. I just want them to sort of have been there when I launch into my comments. Just one hint about what I'm getting at with this sequence of images. There's some of them I consider art, and others I don't consider art. And this distinction between art and non-art, it's not an invidious distinction. It's not a distinction. It's not a hierarchical distinction, but I think it's a very important distinction, and it has a lot to do with what I want to say. In the brochure that the school put out announcing the show, the phrase civil society popped up. I'm just going to plunge into this. There's this vague notion of society. Every human just about is a member of a society, but very few societies, and in fact only very recently developed societies, count as civil societies. There was a review of a book by a sociologist by the name of Robert D. Putnam. It's called Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community. The review is by a writer called Alan Ryan. It appeared in the New York Review of Books on August 10th, 2000. I wanted to quote a few paragraphs from that review. This is Alan Ryan writing about a book by Robert Putnam, a sociologist. Professor Putnam is a highly regarded political scientist who 8 years ago published Making Democracy Work, an important book on democracy in Italy that contrasted the success of democratic politics in northern Italy with the failure of democracy in the Italian South. Putnam's explanation for this contrast reached far back into Italian history. The South had always been the prey of exploiters of many different stripes, but northern cities had long been practicing self-government. They had been self-governing communes centuries ago, and however often they fell under the control of rich, vain, and ambitious ruling families, they had built up a thriving civil society. He's talking about the Renaissance. And when he talks about rich, vain, ambitious ruling families, the first family name that would come to mind probably would be the Medicis. He's alluding to the Medicis, and he's suggesting that the matters we're talking about, he says centuries ago, but in the course of human history, that's fairly recent. This story begins sometime in the Renaissance, and we're heirs to those beginnings. This possibility of civil society wasn't present in medieval times, nor, strictly speaking, do you find it in Rome, not even the Roman Republic, or in ancient Athens, even when it was democratic. So the question is, what does civil society mean? And what did it replace, or what did it come into competition with? Traditionally, Western society had had the following structure. This is very schematic, but it pretty much holds. There was a monarchy, and then there were 3 estates or orders. The first estate was the aristocracy, the second estate was the church, and the third estate was the commons, or the people. The monarchy was more or less powerful. The church was more or less powerful. The aristocracy was more or less powerful in any given situation, say on the Iberian Peninsula, or in northern Italy, or in France, in the German states. And of course, the third estate, the people, was always, under this dispensation, was always very weak. So public life was a jockeying for power between the monarch, the king, and the 2 powerful estates, the aristocracy and the clergy. In the Italian South, there were those powers, perhaps not a monarchy. There was no Italian king or king of all of Italy until the 19th century. There certainly was an aristocracy, a landowning aristocracy, and it was a very powerful church. There was another third force in that culture that did a great deal to prevent the development of civil society, and that was the mafia. So you have a kind of a secret estate, and a very powerful one. Civil society begins to appear when you have individuals who are not under the immediate control and are not thought of as being simply functions of these powerful forces, either a monarchy, an aristocracy, the church, or the mafia. Individuals begin to conceive of themselves sometime after the Renaissance as individuals in our sense, selves whose meaning is not exhausted by their relationship to a superior power. People who get the idea that they have, just by virtue of being individuals, a kind of innate power that's embodied in the idea of having certain rights, certain inalienable rights, to use the Jeffersonian phrase. This comes about with the development, as I said, of the bourgeoisie, which develops out of that kind of personal initiative. It's not state-sponsored. It's not sponsored by the church, and it's certainly not sponsored by the aristocracy. This is market activity. The beginnings of capitalist society produce the bourgeoisie, produces the middle class in all its various striations and hierarchies, and it leads to the Industrial Revolution. So that by the 18th century, you have the beginnings of civil society. You have a very thriving part of society that is not directly responsible to those powers that have coercive authority. There are certain coercions that happen in the marketplace, but they're not the same as the coercions of a medieval member of a medieval aristocracy. A medieval aristocrat really claims the lives and has absolute authority over the lives of those who live on his land. Feudalism isn't exactly the same as slavery, but it has a lot of common characteristics. If you're an aristocrat, you're in absolute power within your domain, which is traditionally established, and you've earned this position not by any accomplishment, but simply by being born to a certain family. And by being born to a certain family and assuming that position, that gives you an absolute authority over large numbers of other people who are likewise born into their position. Civil society is what disrupts all this, or at least comes into competition with it, With the development of a market economy, you have individuals who can establish, at least in the beginning, maybe only just economic power that gives them a kind of independence from the monarchy and the various other states. And so it turns out that the great revolutions of early modern times, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, are the work of the bourgeoisie, are the work of the commercial middle class. And the opposition to it comes from the monarchy, the established church, in France anyway, and the aristocracy. They have to suspend their competition to deal with this new competitor, the bourgeoisie, with its revolutionary ideas. And they really are revolutionary because they're based on a new idea of what it is to be human. That to be human is not simply to be born into a place and live out your life in that place according to dictates over which you have in which you have no say, but rather to be an individual. And this is an idealized version. Even now, or maybe even especially now, it's not realized all that often, but it became possible to have this ideal of the self as something to be self-realized. Individuality as something to be fulfilled on individuality's terms, not terms dictated by the church, not terms dictated by a hereditary aristocracy, not terms dictated by an absolute monarch, but terms that you make up as you go along. And so it makes sense that the idea of creativity, which produced the Industrial Revolution, quickly moves over into the realm of art, literature, and so on, and becomes a kind of watchword of that kind of activity, the creative person, the ideal of the artist. The artist becomes sort of the emblem of this new way of thinking about what it is to be human. Because the marketplace that develops civil society, this private society, the society that does what it does by virtue of agreement and contract, not by virtue of coercive power. This new kind of society, it develops out of the marketplace, it develops out of capitalism, which has all its problems, as we know, especially in the last 7 years. But it isn't, the marketplace is not limited just to goods, buying and selling, or getting and spending, as Wordsworth, the poet Wordsworth said. It's not just limited to goods and services, the exchange thereof for money. Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of the good Supreme Court justices, in contrast to many other not so good Supreme Court justices, came up with the phrase, the marketplace of ideas, because he saw that this self-realization of individuals within a society that they're making up as they go along, really, even if it doesn't have to do with the exchange of goods and services, even if it only has to do with the development of a literary scene or an art world, it has its resemblance to a marketplace. Things are exchanged, ideas, meanings, values. And in the exchange, new meanings, values, interests are created. This has everything to do with our idea of what art is. For an aristocracy, art is imagery that aggrandizes the aristocracy. For the church, art is what conveys the doctrines and makes beautiful and glamorous and alluring the doctrines of the church. For an absolute monarch like Louis XIV, art is what gives this, I mean, even someone of my temperament who has no sympathy with these traditional forms of political and social power has to admit that what Louis XIV did in the way of art sponsorship to create imagery, vast landscapes, extraordinary architecture, amazing painting, sculpture, and so on, things that were ephemeral, performances of all kinds, musical, dance, theater, all those things that he did to try to almost revive that ancient idea of the king as a kind of god. He was known as the Sun King. All the things he did to aggrandize that image of himself, or that he sponsored, is splendid, and it's still with us. You only have to go to the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, or the great gardens that were laid out by Lenôtre just to see it. And it's not a question of rejecting all that, but it's important to note that when we get to this stage of history, which really comes into focus in the time of the great 18th century revolutions, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, when we look back to earlier art, say it was art in service of the church, say it was art in service of the goddess Athena, say it was art in service of Louis XIV, that we look at it in a different way from the way it was intended. We read into, maybe rightly, maybe wrongly, we read into it a modern, into the artist's intention, into the results of the artist's intention, the work. We read into that earlier work a modern intention. Now, I'm not sure that's wrong. It may be that underneath the service to the king or the church or whatever, there was the same kind of creative imagination at work as you find in a contemporary artist, or maybe not. But in any case, we read that into it. And when we do, we find things that are extraordinarily important to us, because the art that I call early modern, the art of the 18th century, right up to the present, of course, is the heir to all that earlier art that goes back to the time of Homer and the ancient Cycladic sculptures, and even farther back. So it's not a matter of rejecting the art that was produced by these earlier forms of society, political power, and culture, but rather learning to see them, or we can hardly help seeing them in our own way. And I think it's quite different from the way that Louis XIV would have wanted us to see them. Anyway, to go back to Ryan's essay for a moment, just to try to give a little more substance to this notion of civil society, he says, this is the review of that Putnam book about, it's called Bowling Alone. He's lamenting the fact that, or his belief that in America, contemporary America, the sense of community is somewhat disintegrated. And Alan Ryan is reviewing it, and in the course of it he says, by civil society, writers have meant something not very precise, but intuitively plausible. Strong civil societies exist in those places where the citizenry trust each other, where they are inclined to keep their bargains, where they are not inclined to cheat strangers or to give and take bribes, and where they encourage good citizenship in one another by unofficial means. And the unofficial, that means that a citizen of a thriving civil society is a good citizen in the course of his or her self-realization. It's something that one does willingly. They encourage good citizenship in one another by unofficial means. The thought goes back at least as far as Adam Smith's explanation of the rise of capitalism. You know that book, The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, which came out in 1776. The only reason I remember that, of course, is 1776 is the year of our revolution. Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, about the rise of capitalism in Britain. And the expression civil society goes back at least as far as Hegel's account of the intermediate institutions that link private citizens and individual families to the more narrowly political institutions of the state. In fact, there was a friend and colleague and contemporary of Adam Smith, who was an 18th century Scotsman, a man by the name of Adam Ferguson, who in 1767 wrote a book called An Essay on Civil Society. And his notion of civil society is much more congenial to me, at any rate, than Hegel's. The problem with Hegel, one of the big brains of all times, you know, it was really up there with Plato as far as just sheer brain power. But there are certain inclinations in his writings and his, I suppose, not his thoughts so much as his feelings, that are uncongenial. The problem, Hegel is very acute in describing civil society, but the problem for me comes in when he argues that ultimately the state, the institutions of the state, with their coercive powers, police powers, regulatory powers, military powers, finally have to be dominant over civil society. The problem with this takes many forms. On the left, it leads to Marxism, and Marxism leads to the Soviet Union, a society a totalitarian society where there was a deliberate and in certain ways very sophisticated attempt to eradicate civil society, to make the individual a function of an all-powerful state. Now this seems a little exaggerated. It is exaggerated. I mean, no state has that kind of power, but they came pretty close. I mean, you know, there were plenty of failures to exert absolute power in the Soviet Union, but that was the ideal, and it was a very, very powerful state. And it did go a long way toward eradicating the early beginnings of civil society in Russia, as Russia became Marxist and expanded to become the Soviet Union. That happens on the left. On the right, Hegel's idea that civil society has to be under the thumb, so to speak, of coercive political power gets all mixed up with nationalism or ultimately racism and leads to fascism. So Hegel is willing to acknowledge the virtues of civil society, but he put them in his large scheme, which again is as large as Plato's scheme in the Republic. He put civil society in a subordinate place, and that's precisely where a thriving civil society can't be. And what's good about Ferguson's book is that, I won't try to rehearse the argument in detail, but the general upshot of it is that all this private activity that creates the marketplace for goods and services, creates what Oliver Wendell Holmes later called the marketplace in idea, the marketplace of ideas that generates art, literature, and high culture as we know it now. All of that ultimately, because it comes under the heading of free expression, especially in the marketplace of ideas, and the citizen of a thriving civil society is considered to have innate rights, including the right of self-expression, that the political powers that compete and get along with, in a productive way, with a thriving civil society, has an ironic relationship to its own power. Rather than be absolute, as Louis XIV wanted his power to be, as Hegel thought any true state ought to be, as Stalin thought the power of the Soviet state should be, as Hitler thought the power of the Third Reich should be. In a government that gets along with a thriving civil society, it doesn't think that its power should be absolute. There are some things that it's not supposed to do. It's not supposed to have the power to do. And these, when it comes to the crunch time, come down to rights, the rights that are in our Bill of Rights, and in the variation on that Bill of Rights that was part of the first Constitution that came out of the French Revolution. And of course, after World War II, the UN has its own version. It's a declaration of the universal rights of humanity. These are individual rights, and again, a government that can get along with civil society knows how to limit itself, knows how to rein in its powers so that civil society and the individuals who make it up can continue to thrive, can continue to realize themselves, express themselves, whatever it is they do, commercially, artistically, politically, or socially. And there are many other ways to realize oneself, but it's something that self-realization is something that's anathema to an absolutist state, an ancient one, a medieval one, Louis XIV or a 20th century one. This has everything to do with the possibility of art, and what I want to argue is that art has a part to play not only in realizing itself, but in sustaining the idea of these freedoms and rights, and in an exemplary way. Before I launch into the slides, I'd like to quote from another essay that was in the New York Review of Books. This one appeared in April 27th, 2006. It's by Leonard Bernardo and Araya Nair. It's called Russia, The Persecution of Civil Society. It's about the policies of Vladimir Putin, the ruler that our president finds so congenial. This is from the Bernardo Nair essay about Putin. On January 10th, this is in 2006, Russian President Vladimir Putin signed into law the amendments to certain legislative acts of the Russian Federation, which radically curtail the independence of the country's non-governmental organizations. Russia's parliament, the Duma, had passed the bill in its third reading in late December by a huge majority, 357 in favor and only 20 against. When you get majorities like that in what is supposed to be a legislative body, you know that the marketplace of ideas is pretty much shut down. Bernardo and Nair go on. With the Duma providing no check to on Putin's power, and after measures to curb businesses, regional governments, and radio and television, the new law is an attack against civil society. After the state shut down the last remaining private national television channel in 2003, radio and television now offer few views that challenge the government's policies. And if you want to have the one measure, there are many measures of the success or failure of a civil society, but the one that is always up front and is perhaps the most effective as a measure of thriving or failing as a civil society is the, not just the pro forma freedom, but the actual energy and exercised freedom of private media. Not state-run media, not the media of the official party in a one-party system, but private media. And that's why they concentrate so much on the shutdown of the radio and television and other media. At a certain point in their article, these two writers talk about Putin's attempt to return to, quote, an earlier era. The earlier era they mean is that of the Soviet Union, which supposedly is a thing of the past. In fact, is a thing of the past, but their point is that its spirit is being revived by Putin and his policies. An earlier era could be interpreted another way, just as pre-modern times. And there is a kind of traditionalist feeling in Russian society, or perhaps you could say it's a part of Russian culture, kind of in Dostoevsky's novels, the characters who have this feeling are called the old believers, like believers in earlier liturgies of the church and earlier forms of peasant life and so on. So an earlier era could be pre-modern times. It's very unlikely that Putin is going to be able to turn Russia back into medieval Russia, but he seems to be doing a pretty good job in turning Russia into a kind of simulacrum of the Soviet Union. That brings me to my first slide, which was published in the Soviet Union in 1953. I'm sorry, 1954. The artist is Vladimir Livanova, and the great slogan is, the big print is "Break Virgin Lands." There was a tractor developed recently, and it was put into production, and there was great success actually in improving the agricultural output of the Soviet Union during this period. It was with the help of this tractor, which it's interesting that the style of this is very much like Western academic painting from the 19th century, and of course whatever economic success the Soviet Union had, especially in manufacturing, was based on Western forms like the assembly line. So there's a kind of irony there that Soviet society never came to grips with. But at any rate, the small writing is translated, not all that elegantly, I guess, as These lands are priceless. Year by year, we should raise more and more grain for the people. This, I suppose few would disagree that this is a propaganda image. And I'm going to go on to argue that propaganda is not art. But I think we ought to linger a little bit and ask what propaganda is. Propaganda is a certain kind of illustration. As you may remember, I have different kinds of illustrations a little farther along. This is illustrating a kind of argument. It doesn't make the argument. The argument is that if we use these brand new tractors and we really work hard, we'll increase grain production. It's a sensible argument, and in fact it turned out that way. But the thing I want to stress about this is something so kind of obvious it might be overlooked. The image itself cannot make the argument. The image can only illustrate the argument. It can only exhort us to agree with the argument. But once again, it can't make the argument itself. Visual things can't do that. Even with the captions, even with the exhortations, it's still rhetoric. It's not argument. But I think it's an effective piece of rhetoric. I mean, and you get the same sort of thing in the West. Here's a poster from, an American poster from the middle of the Second World War, "United we are strong, united we will win." And this is at a time when the Allies include the Soviet Union. You notice the flags on the barrels of the cannons. There's Great Britain, America, nationalist China, and the Soviet Union. This is at a point when they were our allies. The latter two, or the last two, ended up being our enemies in the Cold War. But at this point, united we were strong, and united we did win. So again, I'm not pointing this out as propaganda to say that it's nonsense. In fact, it illustrates a very powerful argument that was fulfilled. But again, it's an illustration. It doesn't make the argument. Here's one British counterpart to the American one we just saw. This is a little less general. Let us go forward together, Winston Churchill, the great wartime leader, with Roosevelt and Stalin, of the effort, the successful effort to defeat fascism. Let us go forward together, this theme of unity. And here, the togetherness, so to speak, includes women. Because in Britain and in America, when the war production machine really got rolling, with so many men in the armed forces, women were recruited to work in the factories. So it was a time of solidarity, which was kind of rolled back after the war, gender solidarity as well, that went along with this international solidarity. So there was this feeling of, well, again, united we will win. This includes everybody. A lot of the characteristics of British and American civil society were suspended somewhat during the war to enforce this unity. But everybody agreed that it was for a good reason. And I suppose on balance one would say that it was, because in fact the assertion, united we will win, turned out to be true. When this poster was published, there was no way of knowing that it really would be true, and there were some dicey moments in the early 1940s where it wasn't clear that we would win, but we did. Let us go forward together. That's a woman who's been trained to factory work and is making an invaluable, what turned out to be an invaluable contribution to the effort. Again, not an argument, but I think a very effective piece of visual rhetoric, propaganda, in support of what I think we'd agree is a good cause. backed up by a good argument. Now, here's another picture of a woman. This is Willem de Kooning's Woman 1. Oh gosh, the dates, he worked on this for years and years. I think the date is 1951, 53. So it's about the same time as that tractor poster. The subject, it shares some subjects, one subject with the propaganda image that we saw just before. That is to say, a woman, and furthermore, a generic woman. It's not a portrait. In a way, it stands for woman or womanhood or even femininity, perhaps. In the propaganda poster, the womanhood has a definite role. Here, it just seems to be an extraordinary spectacle. That fascinated the artist, not just for the time it took, a very long time it took for him to paint this painting, but he painted 4 or 5 more in a series, the Woman series. And then that became his obsessive subject for pretty much the rest of his life. Started doing landscapes at a certain point, but you realized at a certain point that it was really woman as landscape, or landscape as woman, or whatever. I don't think you can really pin it down, because unlike the poster before with its image of a woman, this painting by Willem de Kooning is a work of art. And here we come to this dividing point, art versus non-art. And again, I'm not making invidious comparisons. I'm not trying to set up a hierarchical structure here where one is better than the other. But they are distinct. And what is distinct about them? Oh, I suppose there are many things. But for me, the crucial point, it has everything to do with the way I'm going to try to bring this back around to civil society, is that the poster, you can get the poster. There's only so long you have to look at it. I mean, you might want to come back to it if you think it's especially attractive or whatever, but there's an end to your interpretation of it. It's kind of a one-liner, you know, very sophisticated one, but everything in the picture converges on the task of making a single point, which is not an obscure point. It's a very clear point, and you can get it. My argument about this would be that you can never get it. There's no end to interpreting it. And this is what makes it art. That there are interpretations that are interesting, there are interpretations that are subtle, there are interpretations that are crude and boring, there are interpretations that show extreme personal bias of one kind or another, for and against, either the artist or the subject or the style or whatever. There are endless interpretations, and there is no rational way to say that any one of them is wrong. You might want to say one, it really doesn't interest me, or, oh, I think that one is really, that's the one I always come back to. But because it is a work of art, it has an inexhaustible meaning, or it has an inexhaustible meaning, therefore it's a work of art. That's how I define art. And I distinguish it from every other kind of image, visual, literary, whatever. Now, in the 50s, in New York, the kind of people who looked at this sort of painting, and there weren't very many in those days, were minutely attuned to what de Kooning is doing with Cubism, every last subtlety of his challenge to Picasso and that whole European tradition that he's working off of. He originally was European himself, became one of the great American painters. It has to do with extraordinary subtleties of drawing, tonal modulation, spatial manipulations of the most refined and in some cases outrageous kinds and so on. That's one of the reasons why it's inexhaustible. But I just want to say that it's not just formal complexity of this kind that characterizes what I call an inexhaustible image. I would argue that the same is true of this, this is Robert Morris, 1965, untitled L-forms. This is a kind of art. We call it minimalist, although Morris and his fellow minimalists never liked that word. It was a kind of art that was developed in conscious and highly sophisticated opposition to the sort of thing that de Kooning and all the other abstract expressionists were doing. So it has none of that formal subtlety. But I just want to look at this for a second, just as an example of something that in a certain way is formally very simple, but because of the way it's intended, because of the way it's presented, because of the kinds of references it makes to its past and to its possible future, this too counts as art, which means for me that it is inexhaustibly interpretable. There's no end to talking about it. There's exhaustion, there's boredom at a certain point, but there's no real rational end. You can rationally say of a successful and well-focused, well-designed propaganda poster, I get it, that's the end. I got the message. There's no message like that that art gives you. Art faces you as something that's always going to be open. And if you stop interpreting at a certain point, it may be because you've come up with an interpretation that you especially like, or, as I say, it may just be exhaustion. And real art has the capacity to exhaust you. This is, takes us back into the realm of non-art. And I wanted to throw in a couple of images like these just to say that I really mean it when I say I'm not making value judgments here. I'm not saying that art is better than illustration. This happens to be, I can't remember, you recognize Jack Pumpkinhead and the Woggle Bug from the Oz stories, but it's not John R. McNeill who did most of the Oz illustrations, or the ones I particularly like. It's by an illustrator named Walt McDougall, and it's from 1905. I would argue that just as with a propaganda image, you can finally get this image. If you know The Marvelous Land of Oz, it's one of the later books in the series, and you know about the Woggle Bug, and you know about Jack Pumpkinhead and so on. I mean, this is stuff that I really remember very vividly from childhood and still care a lot about. I mean, I must say that among my favorite visual images, there are some great works of art by Titian or de Kooning or Jackson Pollock or whoever, but there are also illustrations, and some of them are of Oz books. I think it's a wonderful illustration, but I think that it's an illustration by virtue of our power to get it. I mean, there's a lot of formal subtlety here. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of skill. There's a lot of craft. But I don't think it's open in the way that a work of art is. I think that finally you do get it. What you get is its relationship to the story, and that you can pretty much nail that down. It's designed so that even kids can do that, without all this self-consciousness about how we interpret or what things mean. You just, as you read the story and you look at the pictures, you get it. You get the relationship between that happens with a good illustration, and that's a virtue of an illustration, to be able to be gettable in that way, and you leave it behind and go on to the next one. There's not this endless openness. Another favorite illustration of mine is from a 1922 version of or edition of Carl Sandburg's Rutabaga stories. The illustrators are Maud and Mishka Petersham, and this is the father, whose name is, I think his name is Please Gimme, and one of the kids is named Gimme the Axe, and the other one is, oh God, I can't remember the name of the other kid. Oh God. Anyway, if I were to read the story again and remember it all, the same thing would happen. The illustration clicks into a completely decipherable and interpretable relationship to the story, and you get it. You don't have that feeling that there's always something more to be interpreted. This one, I hope it's large enough to see. It's also from the Petersham illustrations of the Rutabaga stories. I just threw it in. It is an illustration. It shows a rat going through a blizzard, but it has, with the snowflakes and the way the snowflakes are beginning to obliterate the figure, that is to say the narrative content of the illustration, it's starting to become decoration, which is another thing that I value very highly and have complete admiration for when it's done well, but also considered to be a form of non-art. There's a kind of decorative pattern that's competing with the illustrative element, and they're kind of in balance here. There's one more kind of non-art image that tends not to come up in discussions like these, but in thinking about all this, it came to mind. The documentary image. Here's an example of a documentary image. A documentary image is an image which, if it is properly captioned, proves something. And you get it by getting the point that it proves. Here is a footprint. It's been dusted so that the photograph shows the tread of the boot. There's the ruler to show the exact size of it. And if this is properly handled as a documentary image, it might well be important in proving that somebody did something. So a documentary image becomes part of an argument. And insofar as the documentary image is properly captioned, insofar as it's not a lie, it tells you a truth, and you get it. There's an end to interpretation once you get the truth about it. So these are the kinds of images, all of which have very high value if they're properly used, if they're properly presented, that are not art. There's illustration, there's decoration, and there's documentary. There may be some others, but those are the main ones that we encounter. And I must say they're the main ones that get mixed up with art and sometimes kind of usurp the place of art in our contemporary art world. But again, art is that kind of image that is inexhaustible. And what, you might ask, is the point of that? I have to admit that the point is rather nebulous or elusive, but the way art works, it's large, a true work of art has among its many other meanings an inexhaustible store of meanings, a discoverable store. It has a symbolic meaning. Because a work of art, in its inexhaustibility, is a symbolic counterpart to the self that produced it. I'm not talking about a narrow idea of self-expression, although some art is self-expressive. But whether it's self-expressive or not, and I think it's arguable that, say, that Robert Morris is not in any ordinary sense of the word self-expressive. Maybe the de Kooning woman expresses something about how de Kooning felt about women. You can't ever really nail that down, but it probably is the case. That's one of the directions interpretation would take, obviously. But just as obviously those L shapes of Robert Morris are not self-expressive, but even so, I consider them a symbolic counterpart to that particular individual. The individual that became, the kind of individual that became imaginable, that began to appear, actually living, breathing, in the flesh, in modern liberal bourgeois society, that is to say, in civil society. So that is one of the things that art does. It supports the idea and the ideals of civil society because it presents visual images that evoke, that invoke, that symbolize, and one hopes communicate this idea or this ideal of the individual. And these words like independence, freedom, autonomy, complexity, self-awareness, and inexhaustible fullness of meaning, these are things that, these are qualities that you can ascribe to a person or to a work of art. Now you can't say a work of art is an object. You can't say that it's literally self-aware, but as we know, there's something about a fully realized work of art in its relationship that with the art that came before, and in its projection of a future for itself that often has a kind of metaphorical quality of self-awareness. It seems to know what it's doing. It seems to know what it wants. It seems to have an intent to mean something, or in ambitious art, to mean, in a sense, everything. It's that richness, this fullness of meaning, which we can find in an individual in the course of his or her self-realization, or in a realized work of art. It's this richness, this fullness of meaning that leads us to say that an individual or an artwork is of inestimable value. It's the irreplaceable site of all that we truly value. Now, this is different from the idea of the individual at earlier stages of society. At earlier stages, which were dominated by absolute or would-be absolute political powers, whether ecclesiastical or secular, didn't really see the individual that way. Saw the individual as a function of that power and to be controlled absolutely by that power. Now, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there are the beginnings, just as there are in ancient Greek and Roman culture, the beginnings of an idea of what we now think of as fully realized individuality, but they're just the beginnings. And it really takes the appearance of modern bourgeois liberal society, civil society, for this to really come into its own and become, in a sense, its own topic, that degree of self-awareness. But there are problems. Let me go back to this and tell a short anecdote that will lead me, I hope, to was not too vague a conclusion to these remarks about the relationship of self and artwork and an ideally realized sort of civil society. In 1958, the Museum of Modern Art sponsored a show called The New American Painting. This made an 8-city tour of Europe and Britain. It made a really big splash. You know, they hated it, they loved it, they laughed, they cried. You know, I mean, it was just, it was an amazing event, cultural event. The extremes of American capitalism in Europe. And there were very powerful Marxist parties, especially in France and Italy during the early years of the Cold War. So it occurred to people in the State Department and the CIA and the Eisenhower administration that it would be a good idea for Americans to start putting a good foot forward culturally in Europe. And there were exchanges between the Soviet Union and America as well. This was part of that propaganda offensive. And what I want to suggest is that even though I see this as a work of art, the CIA saw it as a work of propaganda. They were propagandizing for American society, saying that we're not just, you know, crude, brash capitalists who think of nothing but the dollar, but we also have high culture, and here's some examples of it. And as I say, it made this show made quite a splash. And you see its influence in French and Italian painting especially. In France, a kind of version of abstract expression developed that was called l'informel. In Italy, it was informale. And of course, there were those who really hated it and went off in other directions. But in reaction to this show, New American Painting, 1958, so that it was very effective propaganda. And this creates a kind of ambiguity. It's not that people see Woman One by de Kooning that way now, but there are many other ways of seeing it as non-art. If you see it as propaganda, as kind of proof that the American way of life is really good and better than the Soviet way of life, then you're not seeing it as art. If you see it as just a commodity, which some people do in the art market, you're not seeing it as art. If you see it as an illustration of some thesis about art history or about the nature of painting or about how painting's dead or whatever, if you see it merely as an illustration of a thesis, you're not seeing it as art. If you could buy it and put it on a wall as part of a decorative scheme in your new apartment, you'd be using it as decoration. You wouldn't be seeing it as art. I'm not quite sure how one could go so far afield as to see this as forensic evidence of some kind. In other words, I'm not sure that you could see it as documentary, no matter how you distorted it. But maybe somebody could, or maybe somebody has. But those are all ways, those are all major mistakes, and very tempting ones. Ways of seeing works of art as being visual images of a kind that ultimately are not art. Illustration, especially propaganda illustration, decoration, or documentary. I think I'm going to skip over my the slings and arrows I was going to cast at the kind of critics who don't like poet critics, except to say that they fall into the category of writers who tend to use art as just illustration of a thesis and don't really look at it as art. For a thesis critic who looks at de Kooning or Sherry Levine or Jeff Koons or whomever as their work as illustrations to a thesis about the nature of the aesthetic or about our cultural period, modern versus postmodern, or whatever, to use works of art as illustrations of theses, reduce them to something that you can get. You say, oh, I get what this writer in October magazine is trying to prove by reproducing this de Kooning. It really doesn't do justice to the de Kooning. It's not that that particular argument may not have some point about some aspect of the de Kooning, but what makes the de Kooning a work of art, what makes it, gives it that value, which sometimes you feel is almost equal to the value of the person who created it, or you know, an individual, is that its meanings can't ultimately be gotten, that they're exhaustively interpretable. Now, there's a real problem about associating this idea, this definition of art, to the idea of a thriving civil society. But let me finish by trying to do it. This may sound more like an exhortation, and it may well be more like an exhortation than a solid argument. But I sometimes wonder if any really solid, logical, rational argument can be made here. I think maybe it's more a matter of belief or attitude or feeling. I think we can point in a rational way to some societies that are more successful than others, to use that ancient Aristotelian phrase of human flourishing. Some societies seem to foster human flourishing better than others. But I'm not sure that you can really tie art into that, even though I really deeply, deeply believe that art as we know it, or art as I define it anyway, has everything to do with that. But this idea that a successful work of art, a fully realized work of art, is somehow a symbolic equivalent of a realized human being, or a human being in the course of flourishing, realizing him or herself. I think it has an exemplary value in civil society, if in the marketplace of ideas, if you like, to show the richness of the possibility of idea and image and theme and feeling and motif and all that goes into a work of art. And that in its elusive way is the great contribution that a realized work of art makes to the very idea of being human in a flourishing civilized civil society. So just to stick on message, as they say in political circles. Let me go back to my notes a little more closely. My feeling, if not my argument, is that art has this good effect of being a real tonic for civil society, an exemplary presence in civil society, artists and works of art, both, and that they have a good effect. You won't have these good effects if you reduce art to a means of conveying a message or scoring a propaganda point. The point may be a good one, but in scoring it, in using art as propaganda, you will deprive it of its best effects and its strongest meanings. So, what am I saying? I'm saying that art requires a certain faith. You have to believe that if you are faithful to the best possibilities of art as a symbol of our best values, and as an occasion to celebrate and refine those values, as an occasion to bring those values alive in the course of your experience of art, you have to believe that if you engage art in that spirit, it will be good for you, and as a consequence, good for the rest of us, good for society. Any more detailed account of these good effects would be oppressive, which is to say that any detailed program for art would limit its possibilities in advance. So what I am saying is if we're to be true to our own best selves, we will be true to the best idea of art. And by keeping faith this way, we will advance the cause of civil society. We will advance our best hopes for our communal lives. But it does require faith, especially in the face of the fear that art is about art, that it's a vehicle for realization of selves indifferent to others or unconcerned with society. And this fear is not always entirely unreasonable. Because if art is to be free, it will sometimes be irresponsible. It will sometimes be thoroughly alienated from communal life. The alienation may not be very helpful, but the freedom to be alienated is of inestimable value. And in exercising it, the work of art becomes crucial to our best hopes for our society and ultimately our best hopes for our culture. Thank you. Thank you. I guess I should say, are there any questions or thoughts?
Talking about art, and by the way, thank you for speaking. It's great listening to you. The idea of art and aura, being in a specific place, looking at art, and how that relates to like things that a paper like Walter Benjamin wrote about mechanical reproduction of art, and how that relates to how people relate to it. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Oh, that's an incredible. I mean, that's a wonderful question, but an incredibly complex one, because, oh dear. I think I understand what Benjamin means by the aura, the traditional aura of the traditional artwork in its place, the place for which it was developed, for which it was made. And it brings me back to those thoughts that I had before, or those remarks I made before, about how I do make a distinction between modern and pre-modern society, and I do see, say, art made for the church, for an older piece in a specific church in a specific village, as not being art in my sense of, according to my definition. But I think I did say that we look at it as if it were a work of art in this modern sense, and it may well be that even as the painter consciously intended and successfully intended to serve an absolute power, namely the church, that he or she may well have been doing the same kinds of things that contemporary artists do to come up with the image, so that it may not just be an anachronism to read, say, a Titian altarpiece as a work of art in our sense. That even if you're secular, as I am, and you set aside all of that and just look at it as a picture, not ignoring its history, but not looking at it as an act of devotion, but looking at it aesthetically, that you can that may well be completely legitimate and not an anachronism, not in defiance of Titian's real intention. Okay, that's a problem about the passage of time and the shifting of culture. Benjamin, like a lot of the Frankfurt School writers, had this largely justified feeling that there was something about the extremes, the kind of ruthless extremes of capitalist society, that were destroying a lot of that past and the memory of the past and the ability to relate to the past. And his talk about aura centers on the feeling that, and I think that this reflects something genuine, that you really only get the spirit, say, of a Titian altarpiece when you see it in its original place, the place for which it was intended. You know, it starts with in the 18th century, but Napoleon really puts it into high gear, this idea of ripping things out of their original place and taking them back to Paris, you know, starting museums. In other words, the altarpiece is now hanging on a white wall. Benjamin and many others, including John Ruskin in the 19th century, saw this as destructive. One can intuitively understand why they did this. I don't remember exactly the next twists and turns of Benjamin's argument, but it seems to me that he was saying that even in genuine works of art, aura has been destroyed by the ruthlessness of just the capitalist flow of money, information, images, and so on, and that there's no hope of returning to that earlier stage, so that what artists ought to do is to somehow take advantage of all the forces that have destroyed aura and put them to a good cause, which for him was the same cause that we saw in these propaganda posters from the Allies. Although he was in Germany in the 1930s, and it was at an earlier stage in the development of fascism, but that was what he was against, and that's what he thought artists should do, to accept this mechanized art, this art that's been stripped of its aura, and use it. I suppose he meant to use it as propaganda in what was indeed a good cause, the anti-fascist cause. The other really interesting part in that essay is that he says that aura does survive, that spiritual quality, you know, that we generally think of as pre-modern and are nostalgic for. But it does survive in Benjamin's account of German culture in the 1930s in a debased or even demonic form, as it's exploited by the Nazis in their propaganda imagery. And so he's saying that not only can we not get back the good aura from previous times, insofar as aura, the spiritual quality survives, it survives in a very, very bad form. And so the really responsible, the politically responsible artist will wash his or her hands of the very idea of aura, or get out from under its nebulous cloud or whatever the image would be, and get to work just doing effective images that will fight the aura of fascist propaganda. Now, this runs counter to my definition of art. I'm saying art is not propaganda. But I have to say, you know, there's a reason why that essay has survived and continues to be read, that Benjamin was writing in a crisis that was very real, and to which he responded with an argument that still has a lot of force. I think there is room there's always room for the use of images to make good political points. And if that runs across or crosswise to or conflicts with my definition of art, that's not really a problem. I mean, again, when I say there's propaganda which is not art, and then there's this other stuff which is art and is much harder to describe or define, I really want to insist again that that's not an invidious comparison. I'm not saying that, I mean, a good poster in support of a good cause is really a good thing. I mean, how could one argue against that? I only argue that it's not art. And so I suppose that puts me at odds with Benjamin at some point in his argument. But I'm certainly not against his, I mean, the argument that he came up with in the depths of a really, really bad crisis is one that I think still has a force now. But okay, one last thought about that. And it brings me back to those critics who don't like poet critics, the art theorists, the sort of October writers. It seems to me that it's one thing to praise, say, politically engaged art, especially if the politics are politics that you accept and admire. But I think there is something troublesome about putting imagery of that kind in the place of art, or saying that's what good art is. It's not what good art is, it's what good propaganda is. And there's a need for good propaganda, for illustrational images that persuade us to believe things that we ought to believe. Because there's rational argument, there's rhetoric, and there are all sorts of things and just sort of intuitive communal feelings that might lead us to accept good ideas. And they're all valuable, and I don't think you could say that one is any better than the other, but ultimately, art's value doesn't ever have a definite message. It's not valuable because it ever has a definite message. It's valuable for, in a sense, the opposite reason, because it's absolutely or ultimately open. Yes?
Would you describe the role of art, as you've laid it out, as having a spiritual purpose?
Well, as I mentioned in passing, I'm a secular sensibility. So spiritual is always kind of a tricky word for me. But there is the spirit, and a lot of the art that I take very seriously descends from late 18th and early 19th century art that comes under the heading of Romanticism, William Blake and so on. And in fact, William Blake was a deeply spiritual, not to say religious person. He kind of invented his own version of scripture. And that spiritual energy, which I see reappearing, say, in Walt Whitman, another secular sensibility, but with the same intensity of energy, and as far as I'm concerned, has to do with that ideal of a really expansive, really ambitious kind of self-realization. And I don't object to saying there's a spiritual aspect to that, but my sense of it doesn't tie into any particular
I mean, I didn't mean it in a religious sense, but it seems like the territory you've laid out is as a sort of counter anchor, into the rational world, that it's sort of a romantic beyond that takes us out of the realm of controllability.
See, I mean, right at the very end, I talked about art being alienated. There are many ways of art being alienated. It can try to transcend to a kind of aesthetic heaven, or it can just be the work of somebody who just hates people, or, whatever. And that's always problematic. But if it's art, if it's an image that has this kind of richness of meaning, this openness, that it really does live in our world ultimately, and that it has a real purpose and a value in doing so, that it gives an exemplary instance of what it is for something to be open, richly meaningful, and self-realized. And that as otherworldly as the imagery may be, say if you look at those really sometimes quite mad images of William Blake, and his prophetic verses, which you have to spend a very, very long time on them to have the slightest idea of what he's talking about. But if you even get a glimpse of it, you realize that this has a bearing on ordinary life. As far as Blake might have been out of it in some sense, some transcendent sense, maybe he was psychotic, I mean, we don't really know. But it is art. It's not the art of the insane in his case. I mean, I only mention that because he did seem to have visions, that were things that weren't really there. But that ultimately it has the sanity of something that is relevant to ordinary life. Not humdrum life or routine life, but by ordinary life I just mean life at ground level, where we are members of society and have this great task of trying to get along with each other and have some kind of meaning to the effort. And that art has this, it may be very roundabout. It certainly can't be nailed down, and I don't think there would be any, I think it would be a bad thing to try to nail it down, but this exemplary richness, this sort of, the example of self-realization that a real work of art gives you, I think wherever the artist wants to go with it, again, it may be to some transcendent heaven, it may be to some inward alienation, it may be God knows where, but if it's really art, it has a practical, real, and meaningful presence in ordinary life. And that's, for me, its ultimate value. I mean, an artist may have to go very, very far afield. I mean, just take a look at some of those prophetic books of Blake to see how far afield you can go. Or, like Whitman, you can just sort of wander around in the streets of Brooklyn and look at things, but they're equally, as I see them or read them or whatever, they're equally of our world. They're equally at ground level, and they're equally meaningful. Yes?
Maybe discuss a little bit about Pollock and maybe your idea of documentation, not necessarily all languages.
Oh, are you getting at the sort of literalist reading of Pollock?
Well, no, I mean, as an artist, I think I respond maybe. Sorry, we're recording this. As an artist, I think maybe I respond to a Pollock in a very physical kind of way.
Yeah.
And to me, it's a lot about him documenting his physicality and my relationship to that physicality. So in terms of maybe that failing to be art, I find it a little bit problematic.
Yeah. See, what I would say there, the question is about Pollock, and it's a really interesting one. One way of looking at those streaks of paint, when, the gestures, is reading them as evidence of the gestures that he actually made. Actually, you can do that with a Titian too. Maybe it's not as dramatic, and that is certainly part of it. And then, your question, you bring up the possibility of a literalist reading of Pollock. It also brings up the question of photography as art too, because, in a certain way, a photograph is evidence of what was hitting whatever it is. I don't know the technology very well at the moment the shutter clicked. So there is a literal and documentary aspect to many works of art. Visual art, it's a little hard to see that in literary art, but because of the abstraction of language. But when you're right, when you have a physical object, you can read it as evidence of certain things, including the gestures of the artist. Now, what I would say about that is not to play down the documentary quality or the evidentiary quality or the interest that it has just as evidence. But I would say that the evidence is not always as clear as it is in the kind of image that the judge in a courtroom wants a forensic image to have. even as evidence, there are certain ambiguities in Pollock. And then there's, beyond the evidence, there is all the quality of color, light, space, and so on, and you're sort of off to the races. So not to deny the evidentiary power of those works, which incidentally people like Robert Morris and Donald Judd thought was the most important thing about Pollock, and thought that they could improve on by being even more literal and less imagistic. So I don't want to deny that. In fact, I think that's where the power of the work begins. But I would argue that it takes off from there, too, that it becomes an image as well as evidence. And that's quite an amazing thing, I mean, that Pollock was able to do that. There are all sorts of fake Pollocks, and one of the things that they don't manage to do is to make that transition from being evidence of spilling paint to working as an image. But the Pollocks that he kept, the Pollocks that we see, all do that, and it's an amazing thing. But especially if one's a painter, I suppose that one responds first of all, you know, to the evidence of his gesture, and that is a documentary quality, but it goes beyond that. Let me just take one more. Yes.
Can you just elaborate a little bit about church throughout the two different periods, right? Well-known, well-accepted artists, you know. Could you just sort of talk about that?
Clifford,
in terms of what you discussed.
Clifford Still and
Frederick Church.
Frederick Church.
Landscape painter, you know, in a way, and one
Yeah.
completely away from taking romantic notion, but not really painting something which what you talked about, a photographic image or something.
Yeah. Well, the names of Clifford Still and Frederick Church, the great 19th century American landscape painter, and you're asking.
Clifford Still is the later painter who takes a sort of kind of leap from similar kind of romantic notion of painting.
Yeah, I'm
I
not.
think, you know, you just were talking about earlier. I was just going to talk about Egyptian art and Indian art, but that's too long a period, so that's why I brought these two arguments.
Well, yeah, that's too far afield for for us. Let me just finish up by saying you throw out the names Clifford Still and then the great Frederick Church, amazing painter, landscape painter. In terms of what I was saying, you know, they do carry on, one in the 19th century, one in the middle of the 20th century, carry on with this romantic idea of the individual as a heroic creator. They're both Americans, and there's something very American about the scale of their heroicism, even the scale of or just the sheer size of their paintings, their sense of space, their sense of light, the sheer massiveness of it. Let me end on a kind of cautionary note. I was talking about the realization of the self and how paintings can exemplify that. Paintings, other works of art, in whatever medium, visual, literary, theatrical, musical. If there's a problem with figures like Clifford Still and Frederick Church, is that their conception of themselves put them in a kind of isolation. I mentioned alienation. I could have said isolation. There's a problem that their work may suggest to us that self-realization is something, and this is an idea we get from Thoreau, right? He felt he could only be himself if he went away and spent a year on Walden Pond. This is a kind of an antisocial idea. And the question of whether that isolating or alienating or Thoreau-like sense of self-realization is ultimately good or bad for society, it seems to me is up for grabs. I mean, maybe ultimately it's good, but on the other hand, again, to end on a cautionary note, one of the things that art challenges us to do is to make a judgment about the quality or the nature of the self-realization we see in a successful work of art. If it's a work of art, there's some successful realization. Well, you have to determine it for yourself. And you have to, the viewer and ultimately society, communally has to decide that. And it may not be that the ultimate question is, what is the value, say, of a painting that Frederick Church painted by going off all by himself somewhere high in the Andes, you know, and coming back with an image where it seems as though he's kind of conceiving himself as God in Eden, you know, and creating a new world in paint. It may not be that that's the important thing to decide. We do have to decide whether we like it, what it means, whether it's any good or not, whether it really counts as art. But what may ultimately count is not our judgment about the work, but our communal effort to make sense of it. That's where the cohesive energies are stirred up and have their real benefit for society. So that it's not a matter of coming to definite conclusions, it's just a matter of keeping the conversation going. And that conversation turns out to be society itself. I'm going to have to stop now, sorry.